Yes, they can join. I think did we all hear that, the recording? All right. So welcome everybody. This is the Infill and Redevelopment Committee meeting, October 13. And I think everyone who's on has been on before, and everybody knows everybody, unless somebody would like to be introduced, we'll go right ahead and get to the agenda. And seeing none, first item is the draft summary from July 7th, a while ago. Any additions, corrections for the minutes? Seeing none, without objection, they'll be adopted as submitted. Next item is continued discussion of Imagine Nicholasville Road, and we were still, last time we talked about this, we were looking for examples, and at that last conversation had really not identified all kinds of reasons why some examples would not work. So I guess the question for, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but Sally, you were thinking about the parts that were in the 3rd district, and I understand that Councilmember Lamb is not going to be able to be here this morning, so I don't know whether she's come up with anything or not. But Sally, do you have anything to add to? Oh, I take it all back. I was misinformed. Welcome, Councilmember Lamb. But anyway, we'll start with Sally. Additional information or suggestions about places to look?
Sure. So last time we spoke, just to recap, we were kind of looking at areas in the 3rd district that along that corridor, that number 1 was not UK, which is a lot of that corridor. And number 2 was mostly rental already. So more or less, if you which I think is what we're kind of considering or moving to, if you took out 4 standing single family structures and turned them all into one multifamily unit, the impact to the neighborhood would not be substantial because everything's mostly rental already. That's that's more or less the process mentally that I went to it with. And we had talked a lot at the last meeting about the State Street area. And so we all know from reading the Herald Leader, or just hearing about it, UK wants to move into the State University Street area, and they're in the process of buying up several of those homes. So what I did was I built a map first that identified the rental properties along that stretch of the 3rd district that we're looking at, and then also shaded out the part that UK has planned to buy. And also I drew like a little line around it so we can see where UK is thinking about in the future. All right. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we can all see this. Can we all see this? The map that I'm looking at? I don't hear you, Vice Mayor, you're muted.
Yeah, it shows on my screen.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Okay, great. So this is the State Street area right here. These shaded areas are what UK is in the process of acquiring right now. Everything within this blue boundary is their acquisition zone for the future. So they've got their eye on it. Everything outside that boundary, however, UK is not planning on, or at least not that I or they are aware of. So if we wanted to consider something in this area, I would look right here because there is a heavy concentration of rental already. Pretty much everything's rental. And I don't think if we wanted to upzone any of these in a row, I don't think that it would impact dramatically the way that the neighborhood operates currently. And also the benefit of these is, you worry, one of the big concerns that we hear a lot about multi-family upzoning is the impact on traffic. And you can tell these guys right here just on Waller. I think that one of these guys, or maybe a couple, are already multifamily. But as you can see, it really doesn't. I can go ahead and put this layer on. And maybe we can zoom in a little bit closer. It's a little tricky doing it on my laptop. There we go. So yeah, a lot of these are single family homes that this whole area could theoretically be upzoned. Any feedback on that? Or would you like to see more? Because I did it all the way down to like the Southland Drive area, but on Southland, as we identified, it's mostly commercial. And if we wanted to look at that, I could keep on scrolling.
Why don't we stop for just a second and get some feedback on what Sally has been showing us. So anybody comments, questions?
I wasn't on the last meeting, but do we have the acquisition schedule or timetable for UK on those properties?
No, unfortunately, I might be able to get it. And what I've seen has been a close-up look of this area here where they're currently acquiring. And I have seen a kind of generalized map that I was able to get this blue line from. But anything more detailed than that, the maps that I've got really don't show that. And I don't believe we have ever seen anything that would be close to a timeline.
Okay, thanks, Sally.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just add that anecdotally, I've heard from individuals who own homes over there that they're in the process of selling right now. And so UK is moving on it. I don't know what their timetable is for completion, but they're beginning that process. So it might be sooner rather than later on those properties. Anybody else?
I'm sorry for joining late, so just, and maybe you all already talked about this before I got on. Ms. Warfield talk about upzoning. Have we discussed potential of what type of zoning, since this is residential? What is potential? What are we looking at? What's possible?
I don't think that's a me question.
No,
more technical expertise than I have.
Well, and that's true. And I didn't mean that. I just, I think that to either vice mayor or to the planning staff, I mean, if we're, excuse me, if we are understanding that we have the ability to initiate zoning, what would be some potential for this area?
So, Jim, you want to jump in on this?
I'll certainly be happy to start that conversation and invite Chris Woodall to be a part of it as well. As Sally pointed out, the portion along there is mostly not multifamily, but it is R2. So everything on both sides of Waller Avenue that UK is not looking at and that UK is looking at is R2, with the exception of a couple of spots. And right there in the middle of Waller, where there's an apartment building, is an R3. And then next to the railroad tracks on the south side of Waller is an R3 zone, but everything else is R2, which is a pretty useless zone for development, the way the zone is written right now. Councilmember Lamb, Vice Mayor, I think, Councilmember Plowman, if you're looking at upzoning and we're talking about getting more housing along and in the vicinity of the corridor for transit purposes, you'd be looking at maybe an R4 or something like that, so that you could do some of this, as we called it with you all last year, the missing middle housing, the fourplexes and the eightplexes and things like that. So you wouldn't necessarily be changing the land use. It would still be residential, but it would be in a much better format that would be managed. Ideally, these would be owned by more professional management companies, and you'd have you'd fix the driveway situation coming in and out of Waller. So, just redeveloping both sides of those blocks into a higher density, multi-family type environment would be much better, I think.
And certainly, Jim, to sort of piggyback off of that and tie it into what the Imagine Nicholasville Road plan does call for, this does sit within kind of the neighborhood typology, which is typically talking about 2 to 4 stories worth of development, and could be a mix of uses as well. So it could be a mixed use development in that type of area that we're talking about here, or it could be, as Jim sort of described, something that's a little bit more multifamily centric. So there are some options as far as what's generally recommended within that neighborhood typology. So there are a range of zones from a B1, certainly from on the business side, that allows for a residential component, but business on the first floor, or for the strictly residential uses, which are our R3, R4s.
So if I can follow up with a question. Obviously R4 would not allow for mixed use, or it would?
Would not.
Would not. Mixed use would allow for essentially everything that's allowed in R4 plus first floor. But if it's mixed use, remind me of the regulations. If it's mixed use, there has to be some balance between commercial and residential to ensure that there's enough residential. Is that right?
Yes, the first floor has to be non-residential.
Can the whole thing be non-residential in a mixed use, or do they have to have some residential?
You have to have some, no,
Okay.
the whole, well, now you posed an interesting question, Vice Mayor.
In the B1, you could have all business in that zone.
Yes.
Or the option is allowed for you to have residential on the upper floors as the zone's currently written.
The strictly mixed use zones, I'm not sure, but Chris is right. The B1, which we don't get many people to take advantage of, but certainly does have the non-residential on the bottom floor. That is required if you have residential on the upper floors.
Okay, but so a mixed use in that area, it seems to me, would be pretty appealing. It would both be increasing residential density and allowing for some commercial development along what's already a fairly commercial corridor.
Vice Mayor, I think it's just worth being honest with ourselves. We've thought that would be the case everywhere we've had mixed use, and we've just had such abysmal success with mixed use projects really taking off. And I agree. I think it's still worth pursuing, and if we could get the right folks in there to do it, we just know we've just been very spotty on being successful with that. And it's taken something like a national retailer like Target to even make it reasonably work.
Okay, and I guess looking forward, the demand for commercial property is not huge at the moment and might be decline, retail especially. So maybe it'd be interesting to have a conversation about that, whether R4 would be the most appropriate, but to my mind, that looks like an area that would be worth kind of talking about seriously. Anybody else on that section?
Yes. Is there any reason why we require of the first floor in some of these zones to be commercial retail? Can there be options provided for developers? I mean, because whenever I come downtown on South Broadway, I mean, there's that large student apartment complex and all these vacant retail on the first floor. It just doesn't make sense to me that that's required. What's the rationale for it?
Well, that's a mixed use zone, and that was, I'm sure the desire was, and the thought was that would be an appealing combination of land uses. If you would have services and facilities that the residents of the building would use, then that would make sense, and you would be drawing other people in potentially to that. So it's really more just trying to offer options, but it does require, if you're going to, that's just the way we've written it in the zoning ordinance. Walt, for our mixed use zones like that, if you're going to have residential as part of it, you have to have commercial on the first floor. That may bear looking at the text and seeing if we need to do some updates on that as well.
Yeah, I was going to jump on real quick what Jim said. We've had some discussions about that based around the very topic the vice mayor brought up about the viability of retail and moving forward and trying to provide some flexibility perhaps in the B1 zone where residential, they occur typically in and adjacent to our neighborhoods and can include a residential component. So there's been discussion, at least internally, about looking at that zone and figuring out should we increase that flexibility for the residential component and not necessarily require the business on the first floor. But those discussions are still ongoing internally.
Do we have any data about the mixed use developments in the last, I don't know, pick a number, 5-10 years? I mean, just my visual conclusion is that we got a lot of those mixed use buildings that have vacant retail on the bottom, that as you've said, they've not been very successful. Do we have any data?
I don't think we've done that analysis, Vice Mayor, but I think we're getting to the point, as Chris said, if we start developing a proposal to look at that, I think we want to include that information to show that whatever kind of success or not success that we've had with that.
Are there any examples of where there's been, what comes to my mind is all the places that I go by when I'm driving around that have vacancies, or either some or all of the retail is vacant. Do we know any place where it's been successful?
Well, the hub with Target on the first floor, but the other hub.
But they had that. I mean, they didn't build it and then look for tenant. They had a tenant.
That's right. And that's what we talked about, having a national partner. That seems to work. I'm not sure out of course, this is not really a fair example since it's not representative of an urban experience so much, but in the Summit, I don't know how that's working for some of the retail that's supposed to be above, the residential that's supposed to be above some of the retail out there.
Yeah, Jim,
go ahead, Chris.
Well, that was the example that came to my mind too. We know that the residential component of that has been very successful, and certainly we've seen a lot of the retail. Some of it has changed over time, which you expect, and some of it has stuck around. So it appears to be at least somewhat successful from that component. But a lot of mixed use, to see mixed use be successful, is how it incorporates with what's around it and how it fits in with the neighborhood, the connectivity. I mean, you've got to be able to access it, and there's got to be other things around too. So just providing a mixed use structure doesn't in and of itself make it successful. It's about context and where it's located and sort of the streetscape that's around it. Is it a place where people would even want to walk to patronize those businesses and that sort of thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Jake and I, this is one thing that we kind of sat around in the office from time to time and kind of raised our hands and was like, what is going on here? And so, Jake was heavily into good urban design and urbanism in general. And so we kind of looked into it a little bit. And what we were noticing nationally is that mixed use could be super hit and miss. And it really seemed to matter a lot too about how the developer approached that first level of retail, in terms of like what has been mentioned earlier. Either they have a national partner coming in, or they design it so that there's more flexibility there, that they may not have a giant national partner. They may have smaller partners that are more local, but it seems to vary wildly, but that piece is critical on how that first level gets designed.
Okay, Stan, you waiting to speak, and then Susan, Councilmember Lamb.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Mayor. I apologize, I missed the last meeting, but it's a really interesting conversation, and Sally's gotten an area that I was really, just seeing what was described in the paper. It seems like Chris and Sally and others are touching on the issue. I haven't really understood. This is kind of an unusual situation. Part of the difficulty of infill and redevelopment is land assemblage. And so you've got a major public entity, in theory, assembling a lot of property. And then if there is a leftover block, or if it's just a block that isn't yet in play, to all the points that are made, Waller Avenue, as it is not going to be a good retail location, but it is a major corridor. So if it was part of a larger 2-block development where you could address parking and access and other things, then that's one thing. I guess it seems like this begs to have a question with UK of what is the vision here? Because there definitely could be support for a small amount of hospital medical center oriented retail, particularly towards Nicholasville, but only if it can be parked and incorporated in a larger development, which could even be the hospital and cancer center expansion, but could ideally include some housing. But if not, then I agree with Jim, the R4 or whatever, it seems like it would be more of a residential upzoning, that would be more incremental strategy. But in either event, Waller Avenue, what this brings up is Waller Avenue is pretty constrained street. And that's not going to change unless there is these opportunities like land assemblage. But, I would be thinking about Waller Avenue as a more complete street, and, in any event, just because you have that opportunity, which you don't usually get, at least on the north side. So that was all my comments.
Okay, Councilmember Lamb.
Thanks. I guess this is a very intriguing conversation, as the initial concept was when we very first spoke about this. I would like to, and I'm not trying to put Mr. Johnson on the spot, and a few minutes ago I looked to see if he was still on. I don't know if Mr. Johnson would be willing to speak. I mean, this is a very interesting concept that is, I would really just love to know what your comments are. And I mean, is this something that you think that the development community here in Lexington would embrace? How do you see that this, the pros and cons, or just your thoughts, please?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for a good development to occur. I'm sure that our folks that are doing multifamily would be interested in taking a look at it. I'm not that familiar with what the market uptake would be on something like this. And I think that kind of, as somebody asked a while ago, what's the complete vision of what UK's got planned for that area, I think is going to play heavily into what can be successful on any of the adjacent property. Typically, we haven't seen a lot of our local developers come into a situation like this. One, because it's maybe too big of a deal that they're used to doing. You usually sometimes will have outside developers that operate on a larger scale, more truly, I guess, commercial type developers that do a huge undertaking like this would be with, taking, this area outside the blue line there on either side of Waller and taking something into that scope to completely embrace and redevelop. I agree with the comments that, this is probably not a good retail corridor, just from my own opinion, and would echo the same concerns about the mixed use space and would encourage flexibility in those zones where mixed use is requiring retail and commercial combined with the residential. I mean, even in Norton Commons, we were up there just a few weeks ago visiting with that developer on Market Street, which is the main corridor through Norton Commons. They have a lot of overturn, and there's vacancies sitting there now in Norton Commons in that mixed use space that they have. So it is very hit and miss, and you have to have everything together, coming together to make that work. And it's really hard to predict at this stage on, what could possibly be there, like I said, from the beginning, without knowing what the true and complete vision UK has for that area. So I don't know if that helped or not, Councilmember Lim, but that's kind of what was going through my head as we're listening to this.
Well, and I appreciate that, because I think it's important for us to cooperate with our development community on this conversation, because it's going to take a collaborative effort. I mean, the city can go in and rezone something, but we're not the ones that are going to be managing it going forward. So I think that there's opportunity here, and I do think that there is some value. Ms. Warfield, I appreciate the Waller Avenue corridor there, because I think that is one area that really does need some love, and this could be a unique opportunity. So I guess I look forward to other comments and what could be next. So, but thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. And so I guess just to be clear, that area could be upzoned and it could sit there and not make any difference. But if it is upzoned, people understand that there's an opportunity. And again, I may not understand completely, but it seems to me that it would not necessarily be one developer that would go in and buy up all the property. It might be a smaller scale. I'm thinking of the Buddy Cowgill. And he's had a couple of places where he's bought up lots or houses, whatever, and put in a kind of a mid-size rental units. So could he or somebody like him buy up 2-3 houses and put up a 4-story apartment complex? I mean, it opens that possibility, and we don't know if somebody would step in, but it seems to me if we were to upzone that, and we can talk about other places, but if we were to upzone that, what it creates is opportunities for the kind of increased density that we think is appropriate in a place where it would work. So again, I don't want to put Todd on the spot, but does that kind of a scenario, do you think people would be interested in that opportunity?
I think if you're talking about our local guys doing it, I think that's exactly the way it would play out, is that you might have multiple players coming in with whatever, whatever the desire is to go. And I can't see the, so along the railroad tracks to Waller Avenue, that block, I'm assuming that's the main area you're talking about. That's what my assumption has been. And then maybe on the other side of Waller there. I mean, that is a big area. And to have the wherewithal to come in and completely redevelop that, it would have to be somebody probably bigger than what we've got here in town to do all of that. So I think the concept of having multiple players in there is very logical.
Okay, other thoughts about this particular area?
Yeah, if I could ask about an analog, I'm curious, this was before my time, but anybody who was around for this, how did Angliana play out? Because to me, this has got like a little bit of an Angliana vibe. Remember how it's like the 524 and the 525 Angliana. Did that used to be houses like this, rental properties like this, and then it got turned into lots and lots of housing that's now used for students? Or what did it used to be?
Stan, were you gonna?
I mean, Jim or Chris are much more qualified, but I think a lot of it was industrial and warehousing. So it was kind of unoccupied or relatively underutilized, like we talked about underutilized property. I don't think too much of it was residential like this.
Okay.
I remember Eagle Distributing being there, and it took up a lot of space. It's now out in our industrial park, but yeah.
Okay, so what it sounds like is that there were much bigger swaths of land that could be more easily
Yeah.
combined rather than these independent little, okay, so that's not as analogous as I had hoped.
I do think, for what it's worth, and Todd can jump in if he feels differently, but anytime we've ever talked to a developer about Lexington, this proximity to the medical center is what drives young, those rents. So if there was a place in Lexington where you could do urban residential that was not just students, that was oriented to young professionals and people who work at the hospital, this is a pretty remarkable opportunity, in my personal opinion, because it's going to not have downtown land prices, at least not yet.
Well, and again, anecdotally, I know that some of the people who used to live on University and State and Elizabeth and so on, a fair number of them were connected to the medical complex, and really liked living there until it became basically all students. Okay, other thoughts about this section? I think this has been useful. Sally, you have additional thoughts going down the street?
Well, we had talked about Southland Drive, and I want to apologize for the weirdness of the data pull. I had to piecemeal this kind of together from the PVA, because right now our GIS department is really involved in redistricting.
Yes, they are.
And I'm not our GIS department, but I did my best. And so they've got beds on them because I was only thinking about the residential area, but this here is what I've got in terms of what is rental commercial, presumably on Southland Drive. And that might be easier to squish plats together to make one unified whole than it would be in Waller. But as I've pointed out before, people really don't want to sell these. They really don't want to get rid of them, but I wanted you to see them. So I plotted them out so you can see what they look like here. But trying to get people to sell, that would be the trick.
Okay, anybody thoughts?
Yes. Southland has always been viewed as kind of a model for Lexington, where you can mix in commercial retail areas with neighborhoods. So, and it's always been used as almost a model. So to go in and throw in more residential and take out commercial retail could end up with something worse than what we have now. Just a thought. I'm not locked into that.
So is this a place where mixed use might actually work? Where you would not be displacing retail, but adding on? I mean, again, personal thought. I've looked at Southland Drive for decades and thought, and it's been improved. It really is so much better than it was, but it still is a place that's just begging to be brought into the 21st century. So, and I don't know, I mean, the existing zoning is all, I presume, is it B1? Is that?
It's mostly B1.
Yeah. And so I wonder, it wouldn't be an upzone to go to mixed use, but.
Right, so that's a good point, Vice Mayor, that the mixed use option already exists, in Southland Drive.
Yeah.
So that could happen now without a zone change. You might need a development plan, but a zone change would not be an issue.
Right. Brittany?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I just had a question, and forgive me, I know it's been a little while since the last time we met, and I think we talked about this, but I guess what I'm wondering is, and thank you, Sally, for putting all of this together. This is great and really helpful to look at. Jim and Chris, a question for you all. I feel like the last time we talked about this and what the committee could do here as it relates to rezoning, how does this fit in with, as I recall the conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, you all, like the planning department was looking at other opportunities for rezoning along the corridor. Is that correct? I was thinking about all the commercial places that we've talked about being underutilized that really have the most, opportunity for adding in, places for residential and things without displacing existing residential. And I'm just wondering how this fits in with your larger vision of what rezoning the rest of the corridor looks like. If you all could either remind me or speak to that a little bit.
Well, certainly what Sally has put together, and I express my appreciation to Sally as well for taking the effort to do this, because I think that does help us to visualize what's possible. And in the Waller Avenue area, I believe, as we've discussed, that would be a very appropriate place to put more residential, particularly because, and again, the goal is to make transit more viable, to put the residents on the corridor so that you're taking the pressure off of the single family neighborhoods for putting more residential in there if you bring them up to the corridor. So you're relieving the neighborhoods, but you're also making transit a more viable option. And then, of course, the retail will follow. You don't have to worry about that so much. If you get enough residences there, then the retail will work its way in. And perhaps we can hit the right chord to make mixed use work along here. But certainly the Waller Avenue area, Brittany, I believe, as Sally introduced, would be something that would be very appealing as far as, and I would think would be fairly easy to do as far as a zone change initiated by the government.
And thank you, Beth. And I guess my question is, are you all looking at other areas of more comprehensive rezoning along the corridor? And how does the conversation this committee is having fit in with that bigger look at rezoning opportunities? And I guess my other question is too, how does Place Builder fit in as far as categories with this? Are we going to use that as an overlay?
Let's let Chris answer the second part there, Brittany.
Yeah, I mean, the place builder will obviously come into play when we're talking about how the development takes shape. It'll also, the Imagine Nicholasville Road as a component of the comprehensive plan will also help shape the developments that come along here as well. So we will be considering those as these decisions are being made. And certainly we have discussed internally, how do we look at some of these that are sort of, I guess, the more no-brainers, right? Where you've got your bigger swaths of asphalt, where we're talking about retail changing, your big anchor stores. Some of those sites are already, I think, appropriately zoned. Like if you look at the mall, it's already zoned B6P that would allow, since the council changed the regulations to allow multifamily, some of the groundwork has already been laid for them to take advantage of some of that. But there are still, quite a few sites along the corridor that are larger sites that are B3 or a highway oriented zones that don't include that residential component or, comport as well to the recommendations of our corridor place type or the recommendations of Imagine Nicholasville Road. So I think we are still looking at those and would like to pursue those, and hopefully with the support of this committee. But I think where we were trying to focus if I remember the conversation correctly, we're trying to focus some of the conversation here on some that would perhaps be a little bit more challenging. And I think that's what Sally has tackled, is looking at some of these places where the opportunities might be harder to find, but are also important. And I think Sally's done a good job of highlighting some of those. But still, with your larger parcels along the corridor, those are going to be easier because land assemblage is not as much of a challenge. But certainly in the places that Sally's talked about with Southland and they're off of Waller, those are going to be challenging. And we were hoping the IR steering committee would be able to help us walk through some of those issues and challenges and sort of remove some of the barriers to achieving some of what's called for in the plan. So I don't know if that helps, but that's just kind of what we're thinking about over here.
Okay, Walt?
Southland is interesting. It's fairly unique in that they have an organization called the Southland Association, which includes I think, most of the surrounding neighborhoods, as well as almost all the retail establishments, and they're quite close to each other. I would think it would be appropriate if we're thinking about Southland at all to bring them in and talk to them. I think the harder nut to crack would be on the really large areas with large shopping centers and commercial retail, but that's where the easy assembling of property exists. I think it might be desirable. I'm sure staff has already done this, but I mean, what would it take for these really large commercial retail plots and underutilized plots to consider adding more residential? I mean, I think that's where I'd kind of like to go with it, see if there's any chance at all and what would be necessary to do it. And yeah, I'm sure you've been talking about it.
Well, that was the whole point of updating the B6P zone to allow residential. And so that's been done now for more than 3 years. That would capture certainly places like Turfland Mall, or Fayette Mall and South Park. And as you can see, we've still had no takers on that. So,
But as part of that,
adding the permission and fixing the parking and the FAR and all of that with that, trying to make it just ready to go, and we still haven't had it. But that's not to say that they wouldn't come. Certainly the Fayette Mall people were intrigued by that, and I think bringing them into the conversation during the Imagine Nicholasville Road helped that. So I suspect that we'll see that eventually.
that's sort of what I was going to add, is that they were part of those discussions when we were discussing our catalytic sites for Imagine Nicholasville Road, and they did have some interest in some of that. And the first thing was to remove our own internal barriers, which we did through the B6P text amendments. And then the next is sort of talk through it with them about what it would mean to incorporate some residential. And through those discussions, we landed on, some of the concepts that we provided. And not everybody was 100% thrilled with exactly what was proposed, but that wasn't really the point. The point was, here's how it could be done. And we've started to have those conversations, and we've reached out to some of the other shopping center owners, and we've had varying degrees of success with them about their interest in doing these things. But for us, the first thing to do is to remove those barriers, which we did with the B6P. And I think by proactively rezoning those properties, also it could reduce some of those barriers for when they do want to take advantage of it, because certainly they're having these internal conversations as well with their management groups about what the future holds as retail changes, and everybody's trying to navigate that landscape too.
Okay, and perhaps I'll add a word too about kind of the frame for this conversation. I think it's not exact, the parallel is not exact, but in the development world, the cliche is making land shovel ready. It doesn't mean that someone's going to come in and next week buy the land or start a development on that land, but it removes some of the barriers to a project. And I think the frame for this conversation is exactly the same, as Chris has pointed out. It's looking at places where proactively a zone change would create opportunity of the kind that we think is useful given the intent of the Nicholasville Road corridor plan. And so what we don't want to do is create further impediments. So it's, that's a part of why this conversation I think is important. And if and as we get further down the road with this, it seems to me the path forward is to say, let's just say that the conversation we just had about Waller Avenue, that future conversations, we conclude, yes, that would be the right thing to do. We want to make sure that we've talked to all the relevant players, et cetera, but that would actually create opportunity. Then we would report it out. We would bring it forward to the council, run it through the planning committee, and say, here's a proposal for an upzoning. And ideally, makes sense to everybody, then that happens. And we could, continue this conversation, obviously, about other places, but, my quick take is that the Waller Avenue example is a good one about something that it looks like upzoning makes sense from most perspectives and is something that we might eventually want to bring forward. And maybe one more comment about Southland Drive. It may be that Southland is, in fact, just this most, because of the way it has developed historically, it is what it is, and it works pretty well. And maybe you don't try to tinker with that. So any other comments about that or the previous and before? Sally, did you have additional example or?
That's all I put together for today. I can use the same process that I did this, though, to really look at anywhere you might want to look at. Where's there a potential cluster, of rental properties that we could look at differently? So, I mean, I've done it once. I can do it again.
Well, this has been very helpful. And yes, I think that we might want to see if you can identify some other places to bring forward. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Councilmember Lamb, did you make any progress on identifying areas?
Sorry.
You're still there.
I'm here. I'm multitasking in the largest ways. No, I did not make any more progress. I guess I know we've had this conversation in the past about the difference between the role of this committee being the infill and redevelopment versus outside of what the infill and redevelopment property. And I know that there's a little difference in thoughts or I don't want to say opinions, but or role in I guess that's one reason why I haven't moved forward to, we've talked about South Park and Mr. Duncan and Mr. Woodall both have spoken before about the fact that, that there's just not an appetite for South Park, the management company, or to do anything with it. So, and those are the things that I was thinking about. I noticed that what used to be the Walgreens or the CVS on corner of Malibu and Nicholasville Road is now getting ready to be a Dollar Tree. So that's turned into something now. So that's not an item that can be brought to fruition. There's still the old Charlie's property that is out right past the Zandel Shopping Center. But again, it's outside of the infill and redevelopment boundaries. And so, so that's pretty much what I have for that. So.
Vice Mayor, I apologize. Chris Woodall and I have to leave now to go to the mayor's office. So we have to excuse ourselves, but please feel free to bring us back up to date.
Do you have one more minute?
Yes, sir.
I guess my question is appropriate path forward. Should we continue to focus on this one example on Waller that's been brought forward? Would that be a matter of developing with your office language for a zone text, and then this committee would make a recommendation to place it on the agenda for planning and public safety?
And we'd be happy to do that, Vice Mayor.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Other thoughts, comments, questions about kind of where we are at this point? Jean?
Yeah, I guess this is a question for Jim and Chris, as well as you, Steve. Is there any process within city planning that, for example, for that University Avenue, Waller area, there could be an overall development plan, master plan, or whatever, so that when the smaller individual developers, like you mentioned, Steve, come in, they're contributing to a planned whole, so it doesn't end up just hodgepodge where it doesn't work. Is there a process to accompany zoning with something like that?
Well, there's small area plans, which is the tool that the planning department has used. But it's important to understand what a small area plan, first of all, it costs money.
Yeah.
It takes time and energy to do it. Secondly, it's important to understand. So I can say this because the professionals are gone and they won't correct me, but a small area plan is a plan which envisions how development could happen. It is not a tool for actually developing anything.
Oh, I
Somebody
know,
has
I know.
somebody has to come in and take advantage of it. And so I'm a little bit sensitive on this issue because sometimes people in zone changes or in other contexts say, well, it's included in, this is what it says in the small area plan, and you're not adhering to that. Well, yeah, it's it's a plan anyway. But I think the answer to your question is there is a mechanism, and that might be a part of what we wanted to consider if we're going to consider some upzoning, is that it would take at least a small amount, if not a full-blown small area plan.
Some hybrid,
something-
some version, yeah, so
Yeah.
things make sense.
Yeah, some guidance for the planning commission and then the council. Although the upzoning ideally would take away the issue of a zone change. And so then it becomes just a matter of development plans that go before the planning commission. So, Sally?
So in the third district, we have looked at a mix of different things that we have going on. And what I think that we're talking about here is a couple different things. On one hand, you've got your small area plan, which is very idealized, and that's kind of how we would like this to move forward. And on the other hand, you've got your overlay, which is legal. And so when you're talking about H1s, you're talking about ND1s, you're talking about courthouse area, you're talking about overlays. And that comes with the force of governance saying, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that. But getting an overlay developed, like if you wanted an honest to God LFUCG is telling you what to do overlay, is going to require justification. We can't just say, hey, Waller area looks horrible. Like we can't come in like Queer Eye, like this is horrible. An overlay so that it has to look nice. Like we would have to have some kind of legal justification there. It doesn't mean we can't ask planning if it's possible, but it does mean that it makes it a lot harder. Small area plan may cost, but it doesn't have that bite, but it's also easier to do, even considering the money. Overlay, because it has bite, we've got to have a really good reason for doing it.
Well, and I would add, again, I don't want to put Todd on the spot, but my sense is that there's a tremendous amount of resistance that you have to overcome if you are proposing an overlay of any kind, anywhere. And a new kind of overlay, I think, would be, there'd be a lot of resistance to that. Is that fair to say, Todd, from the development? I mean, just because it doesn't take, this is not now permissive, it adds a whole layer of justification. So is that fair, Todd?
Yeah, I think that it probably is, depending on what the overlay requires. I mean, it just depends on what you're requiring. And is it going to take more time? Is it going to cost more money at the end to get through it? And does the math work because of it? I mean, for whatever the overlay brings to the situation. So.
And so I want to
Yeah.
say, I think that some of the concern might be coming from what happened in like the Burley American area, where we had kind of a working class area that people wanted to buy up for student housing, but we didn't go in and preemptively upzone it. We just left it alone. And so people came in and put in mismatched, messed up little duplexes that there's no rhyme or reason to the area. It's just like, oh, you want to sell? Okay, I'll take it. Here's a duplex. But what we're talking about doing here is the opposite of that. We're talking about like trying to get ahead of it. And so if anything, I feel like that would make it a little bit more visually appealing, or a little bit more well-developed in a uniform sort of way, just because we're saying, all right, no, we're not doing tiny little duplexes. We're R4ing it. We're wanting something big in this area. And I think that that could provide its own structure.
Okay, and so that's a conversation that we can have with planning staff, because there may be an intermediate way, similar to when you get a zone change, you can put conditions on that. And when you get a development plan, the planning commission has the opportunity to put conditions. And so maybe you do an upzone. I don't know if this is possible or if it's been done, but you do an upzoning and you indicate what the desirable outcome of that is as information to the planning commission when they look at development plans and when they are approving or not approving them. Again, I don't know if there's an intermediate kind of mechanism that can be employed, but that's something that we certainly could talk about. Okay, anybody else on any of this? If not,
Yeah, I wanted to
Okay.
thank Sally for her work and the material she's brought in. And I second what she said about Burley Avenue. It's simply a hodgepodge, and we don't want to do something that leads to that. And the question is, what can be done to improve that? You might be right about conditions.
okay, what I was going to say is a couple things. One, Sally, if you're willing to, as you said, to continue, maybe bring back at the next meeting some additional possibilities. And then I guess I'm inclined to ask the committee if in fact what we've discussed about the Waller Avenue is worth formalizing with the help of the planning staff into at least a possible upzoning, a zone text amendment, to be considered as something that we would forward to the planning committee of the council. Is there enough interest in that to at least get it formalized, ask them to do a little bit of what it would take, and bring us back something that we could look at and consider as a next step? I guess the question is, does anybody object to that, or do you have concerns about that? If not, then that's what we'll do. Stan, did you have a comment?
Just I guess the prerequisite to that would be the discussion with UK. I mean, we can, unless we have some idea, I think we could support UK, but they're going to drive a lot of what those opportunities are going to be. So it'd be good to understand what's in play and what's not.
So is that a question of what they plan to do with the properties that they've now identified for purchase? Or is it about, so let me back up half a step. In all my dealings with UK, my understanding is they have an acquisition boundary and they're not moving it. These properties have been within the possible acquisition boundary for a long time. So, and they always say, we're not, without due notice and process and so on and so on, we're not expanding that boundary. So is your question about what they intend to do within the boundary, or whether they are thinking about expanding the boundary?
It was actually about the expansion, but if you and Sally feel comfortable that blue line is the line, then and you feel like that question's already answered, that's one thing. It would be good ideally to know, I know that they're going through their master plan for the medical center and healthcare already, but it would be good to understand any thinking they have on their property, because I think it's a great idea what you're suggesting, if planning is interested, but you just want to complement whatever that is and have some general understanding of the next door neighbor.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I will take that on. I can talk to the people at UK and I guess either confirm what I think is the case or find out what else, what other information would be useful to us. Anything else?
We could invite George Ward to our next meeting. He's the guy who is responsible for sending out all of these maps and understanding the acquisition area boundaries. And anytime there's like a property management question with that sort of thing, he's the one who contacts the 3rd district. So he would be a good person to reach out to.
Okay, I can do that. Any other thoughts at the moment? If not, then what we'll do, we'll keep this on the agenda for next time. We'll look for more information from Sally. Again, thank you for the good work you've done so far. And I'll get with UK and with staff. And ideally, we'll have a specific language for a zone text amendment and information from UK. Okay, anything else at all? If not, again, thank you all, and we'll next meet, looks like November 3rd. Thank you.